可以用。
Dr. Judd, did you do a prairie plant and animal of the day last time?
I did not, and
I don't recall you doing it. I have ones for today.
That would be excellent.
Awesome.
Had a very challenging morning, so I'm going to do the rest of the succession lecture and then turn it over to you.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Oh, we do have, okay. I thought we're missing a whole lot of people, but it's like many of them are here. Okay, so I will share my screen and we will wrap up our discussion of our introduction to succession. Okay. So last time we talked a little bit about disturbance and some of the different ways that disturbances vary in kind of a conceptual disturbance space that we talked about with these various axes or kind of spectra. And then I was just starting to walk you through an example of a major disturbance event and the consequences, the succession that followed. We talked about the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, what the landscape looks like or looked like in 2015, so already 5 years ago. And I was just starting to tell you about how some of the landscape changed. In the immediate area of the eruption, much of the landscape was buried in various debris flows and avalanche deposits. So in those spots, the land was literally new, and there were new creeks that formed, new soil started developing from the sediment that erupted and flowed down. And scientists have been watching how the plant and animal communities have changed through time. So this is an example of what's called Harrington Creek that has developed into a really kind of a nice riparian zone over the years. Notice that as the initial trees that first colonize get larger and start to form a canopy, they also stabilize the soil through which the creek flows and provide shade for plants that maybe can't tolerate the bright, high light conditions of the first few years after the eruption, but now can do pretty well along the moist, shady streams. This is a series of photos from one particular area where you can see the trees were all blown down and most of the vegetation was gone. There's a little bit that started to come back just a few years or 8 years after the eruption that you can see on the right. Here we go. And then as time continued to go on, we see not just little herbs, but also shrubs start to grow, young trees, especially conifers. They grow reasonably fast in bright conditions, started to come in, and eventually you get more and more, right? It starts to fill in. Meanwhile, the plant biomass that was blown down but remained in the area is also decomposing and becoming integrated into the soil. And those nutrients that are in the biomass are becoming resources for fungi and plants and other things that are obtaining resources from the soil. So this is what we call a chronosequence, right? It's a sequence of photographs taken through time in one spot. And this is what we mean by succession. Communities, ecological communities change all the time, but when we can recognize a common pattern of change, similar species in a similar order, in a similar environment, repeatedly in a given area, we call that pattern of change a seer, which comes from the word series. And this is an example of sort of what you would see at any hillside blowdown deposit near the eruption. So who comes back and why and how? Well, there's a few different categories. There are survivors, plants, for example, that survive because their seeds in the soil or in the mud or in the debris survived, and they could germinate immediately following the eruption or within a short period of time once the seeds start to germinate. And there are also plants like goldenrods that you all are familiar with that have underground stems that store energy as starch or some other storage molecule. And then those underground stems that survive can immediately start to produce above ground shoots, and you get rhizome propagation of plants that made it. So that's asexual versus sexual reproduction in plants, and they both provide means of surviving. Of course, this was more likely in places where there was not as much heat, or the heat didn't cook the soil very deeply, and also in places where the debris flow wasn't very thick, so that the plants can make it up through the new sediment. There are also some animals that survived, mostly things that were able to burrow and avoid the high heat of the debris flows and the ash. So some amphibians that were able to be in the cool ponds, but maybe were covered in ash, but they were able to burrow back out through. So this is a salamander larva. We've got frogs and toads, for example. And let's see, boreal toads. And then this little guy who is, what's the genus on that one? I have it right here. Oh yeah, pocket gophers. Yeah, Thymomes. Thymomes often survived, or these were surprising survivors because they have such deep burrows. So Thymomes were one of the groups that survived. And then ants, many different kinds of ant colonies survived and started foraging among the logs underground. The other kinds of organisms that come back right away are ones that are good colonizers. These are plants that are optimized for colonizing new habitats, freshly disturbed habitats. Often we call these pioneer species. So prairie lupin is a good one. This is a member of the legume family, which we've talked about a little bit out in the field. These are nitrogen fixers, so they're bringing the ability to produce some of the nutrients they need with them when they arrive in the newly disturbed landscape. There's a species of penstemon that had small seeds that are easy to disperse. Those came in very early, as well as things like prairie fire plants and some mosses. So a lot of plants that produce spores instead of seeds, and we'll talk about this more in biodiversity next semester. These have really high reproductive output, and their spores are widespread in the wind and disperse easily. So wherever there's a good wet spot, things like certain mosses and ferns that can tolerate bright conditions are really good colonizers of freshly disturbed habitats. But there's even some trees. It's not just herbs. There are even some trees that we think of as colonizers. For example, alder trees, which is shown in the foreground here. This is another kind of plant, not a legume, but another kind of plant that also brings with it bacteria that can fix nitrogen. And then here's an example of a young Doug fir sapling doing well as a colonizer. Notice there's very little other vegetation around, and there's Mount St. Helens in the background post-eruption. Some of the animals that came in early were things like deer mice and elk foraging on the new young trees and shrubs. As those trees and shrubs developed, we've got a white-crowned sparrow and a common nighthawk. This sparrow is on a willow, which grows quite commonly with alders. So willow and alder grow together in early successional environments, and there's the white-crowned sparrow on that early colonizing plant. And of course, many insects. This is largely what some of the birds would have been eating. Different kinds of grasshoppers and beetles, insectivorous birds depend on these early successional colonizing insects. So there's an example of organisms coming back, changing the environment in such a way that it helps other organisms colonize, maybe by providing food or providing shade, or providing roosting sites for the birds. And this all falls under the general concept of community structure. So when we think about how communities change, we're talking about how the structure changes through time. And there are many different components to community structure. So I've outlined a bulleted list of about 5 things to keep in mind. Really, we're going to focus on things like species richness and diversity. So relative abundance is what I mean when I talk about diversity when we read the Veen et al. Paper. But I want you to be aware of these other aspects of community structure. Richness refers to how many species are present. Composition refers to not just how many, but exactly what species they are, right? Is it a deer mouse or is it an elk? Is it a willow? Is it an alder? So composition refers to the actual identity of the species. And the species that are present are going to have different abundances. Some species are common and some species are rare. And the rarity and commonness of species can change through time as competitive interactions or predator-prey interactions affect their ability to reproduce and for their populations to grow or shrink. It's not all about species. You can also group organisms into functional groups. In the case of animals, we often group things by body size. In the case of plants, as you'll see, we often group things by the type of photosynthesis. So we mentioned C4 and C3 photosynthesis in grasses. Those are 2 functional groups, different ways of capturing energy from the sun. And then community structure also includes, to some extent, different ways that species interact. Competition is 2 species accessing the same resource. Predation, of course, is 1 species consuming another. And in the context of succession, we can really start to think about facilitation interactions, where 2 nearby species, 2 species that co-occur, might benefit each other by changing the environment in a way that improves the ability of each species to grow in its population size, or maybe kind of reduce the strength of density dependence within each one. So positive interactions like facilitation and also mutualism. We sort of distinguish between 2 kinds of succession, primary and secondary. In both cases, a disturbance event removes individuals and changes the availability of resources. One of the obvious ways is light, right? If you disturb a forest, there's a lot more light hitting the forest floor. So that changes the availability of that light resource for other plants. The way we distinguish primary and secondary is basically, to keep it simple, primary means primary succession proceeds from bare ground, little or no soil, total destruction. Whereas secondary succession, there are some survivors that can sort of initiate that new community. It's sort of a blurry line, as I hope I conveyed to you with Mount St. Helens. Even where there were debris flows and lahar flows, there were still some ant colonies that survived and some rhizomes that survived. So it's about as close to primary as you can get, but there still were a few survivors. But generally, we can distinguish between primary versus secondary. And then those early colonizers, those pioneer species, generally are optimized for colonizing sites, and they alter the environment in a way that favors later species. These are some of the ways they might do that. And I'd like to wrap up by, before I turn it over to Dr. Kowinski, by showing you a couple historical examples. The study of succession goes way back in North America, in the United States, primarily because of the way European settlers modified the forests of Eastern North America, even here in Missouri, but all the way east to New York State and further. In the late 1800s, most of the Eastern deciduous forest was cleared for agriculture and settlement and logging activities. Sorry, this is a little bit pixelated, but you can see based on how orange the states are that some places lost a lot of their woodlands and forests. Since that time, certain regions of Eastern United States have experienced an increase in the number of trees, an increase in the extent of forest. And part of that is because some of the land that was originally cleared for agriculture was left fallow as our major agricultural producing centers moved west to the plains. This is especially true in the Northeast. And so the study of succession became focused for a little while on what we call old field succession. So you end up starting out with an old farmland that maybe farmers had abandoned for better lands further west. Maybe there's an old fence line in there somewhere, but basically grasses and low shrubs and trees would take over what would have been either a logged area or a previously farmed area. And certain species of rodents and birds were good at accessing the resources and living in those old fields as the low shrubs and grasses took back over what was previously land used by settlers. And eventually the shrubs and trees would grow and start to create a bit of a canopy, and different kinds of species that need those shady understory habitats to get started would come in, and you get a transition often from evergreen trees like cedars and pines to broadleaf trees like oaks and hickories and maples. And as the trees changed, so too did the communities of birds and rodents and other animals in the community. So this general pattern of an old field successing to this eastern deciduous hardwood forest played a big role in how we understand ecological succession and why we talk about it as directional and leading to often sort of a climax community, a predictable endpoint based on the climate and region and where you are in the world. Here in Missouri, we're on the boundary between the eastern forests and the prairies. So if you introduce fires right around here around the the shrubs and trees section, you can keep things in this grassland scenario. And so we think about succession in the plains and the prairie a little bit differently than we do, say, in New York State, where this kind of a model fits well. It's not all about plants and old fields. You can also study succession in other environments. These are data in your textbook from a classic study in the 1970s, where Sousa put out bare rocks into the Rocky Intertidal region in Oregon. So this is a picture of the Rocky Intertidal. And he studied the abundance, so total cover, of several different species of algae, green and red algae, as they colonized those bare rocks in the intertidal zone, as though you maybe had gone out there and disturbed all the rocks to remove the algae. So just by introducing new rocks, it was as though there was a disturbance event and succession could proceed. And so you can see that certain algal species had high abundance early on, like ulva, which is a green algae, whereas others like Gigartina caniculata, which is a red alga, increased its abundance later over the course of the 2 to 3 years that this study was conducted. So succession happens all over, and it's not just plants, but also algae, and we saw birds and insects and things like that in earlier slides. So a recap from last time to this time. Disturbances vary in several different ways, and we want you to think about the disturbance space, know about those different dyads, know that succession follows disturbance. That's what distinguishes succession from other kinds of community change. Communities can change all the time. We generally distinguish between primary and secondary succession. And as a rule of thumb, you can think if the soil is wiped out, the seed bank was wiped out, and you have to rebuild the soil, we call that primary succession. And secondary succession, the soil makes it, and most of the plants and animals that get the new community started were survivors in the soils. Some species are optimized for colonizing after a disturbance, and we call this pioneer species. And then as the pioneer species change the environment, resource availability changes and succession proceeds. And finally, mutualism and facilitation are important interactions, positive interactions between species, in addition to predation and herbivory, predation, and competition. So that's what I had for disturbance. And now we're going to talk about how disturbance and succession can interact in complicated ways and relate that back to this concept of heterogeneity and scale that we introduced last time.
Do you guys have any questions for Dr. Judd before we proceed? All right. So as Dr. Judd said, I want to talk to you about how disturbance and succession can interact with one another. And he did a good job of setting this up because he went through a set of serial stages that I'm going to revisit with you. Oh, why is my sharing? I've been having trouble with sharing all day today, and I'm not sure why. Okay, but before we do that, I want to go through prairie grass and forb of the day and a prairie animal of the day because we didn't get to do this last time. So I'm going to present to you Cytodes gramma, Bouteloua, which is one of my favorite plant genera. Bouteloua, what's that?
One of my favorite grasses here too.
Bouteloua curtipendula. Cytodes gramma, it's in the family Poaceae, which is the family of the grasses, and it's a C4 grass. So we haven't talked to you yet about the differences between C3 and C4 grasses, but C4 grasses are, C4 plants are plants that have the ability to use water more efficiently under hot, dry conditions, which is why you find C4 grasses common in Midwestern prairies, because Midwestern prairies are typically hot and dry during the growing season, and so C4 plants do particularly well. I don't really have a ton to say about this. It's a bunch grass, so it tends to come up from a common root. It's distinguished by the inflorescences here that hang off the stem, and they typically only hang off one side of the stem, which is why they're called Cytodes gramma. Here you can actually see these red pieces here are actually the anthers. One of the things about grasses is they produce a reduced flower, a flower that doesn't have all of the floral parts in it. I guess this is called it's incomplete, right, Nathan?
Yes, it's incomplete, but grass flowers are so different, we don't really use that term for them. We just
okay, all right. So perfect and imperfect is whether they have all the male and female parts, right?
Yes. Yep.
And complete and incomplete refers to whether or not they have all of the floral parts.
And we talked about petals and sepals and those kinds of things. And
yep,
grasses have a different set of organs.
Yeah, grasses are different. The prairie forb of the day, this just happened to be the one that popped up in this presentation from last time I did this, happens to be a Solidago species. Missouri goldenrod or prairie goldenrod, Solidago missouriensis. It's a perennial herb. As you have seen out in the field, you guys are working with Solidago canadensis, but they don't really look all that different from one another. 1 meter tall, very deep roots, but this is a dicot species rather than a monocot species. So this is going to be a species with a taproot. And once again, this is going to be one of those early successional plants. They tend to colonize disturbed areas. So Solidago, we've talked about this in lab. These things are capable of reproducing by sending out underground stems, rhizomes. And so you will once again see clumps of these goldenrods, and they're all basically the same plant that have just put up stems. Prairie animal of the day is the coyote, Canis latrans. This is an interesting species for a lot of reasons. It's a top predator in many cases, especially in places where humans have gotten rid of larger predators. And so while the coyote might not have been the top predator 200 years ago in many cases, because of the presence of mountain lions and bears and things like that, it certainly is the top predator top natural predator in many places in the United States. One of the interesting things about the coyote is that it's one of the few mammal species that has actually thrived under human habitation. So the old native range of the coyote was pretty much limited to the plains of the United States, but once again, through the activity of humans disturbing natural habitats, they have expanded their geographic range widely. There are interesting photos that people have posted of coyotes in Central Park in New York City. They respond well to the abundance of food that is provided by people's trash cans and people's pets and things like this. And they have adapted very well to human activity. It's not a very big animal to be a top predator. They breed in the first part of the year. They can have lots of pups. This also contributes to them being able to colonize areas disturbed by humans. The pups obviously are cute as can be. Relatively quick gestation time, once again contributing to high reproductive output, which once again makes them good colonizers and a mammal species that is able to cope with disturbance fairly well. So one grass, Pseudosperma, one plant, Missouri goldenrod, and one animal, the coyote. So today we're going to be talking about how disturbance and succession interact, and we're going to think about this in terms of how it determines community structure and whether or not that community structure is very predictable from one disturbance to another. Oftentimes ecosystems don't get disturbed just once and then they're left alone. Oftentimes they're subject to repeated disturbance. And I want to relate this disturbance and succession to resource-based competition. And Dr. Judd was already giving you a little bit of a preview of that when he was going through the stuff that he covered with you today. But there's actually a way of modeling competition that is different from the Latko-Volterra models of competition that Dr. Judd took you through with the Galapagos case study. And this is just a different set of ways of thinking about competition that really focuses on the resource needs of the species. And I'll show you what that model is and I'll show you how it works. And it would be nice to have you be able to compare and contrast competing models for kind of how communities get assembled and how communities are structured with one another. And after this, if I recall correctly, Nathan, is the next thing species diversity or is the next thing photosynthesis?
I thought it was photosynthesis, but let me check here.
Okay, so we'll get to ways of quantifying community structure, I think, later on in this case study. So disturbance we've already defined for you, but just to remind you, here are two definitions. You could think of them as competing, but they basically say the same thing essentially in two different ways. What I want you to concentrate on today is the second one, because it brings in the issue of resource availability formally into the definition of disturbance. So a relatively discrete event in time and space that alters the structure of populations, communities, and ecosystems, and causes changes in resource availability or the physical environment. And so I want to think about things from the resource availability perspective. So this is a simplified model of the sphere that Dr. Judd just showed you, going from annual plants, grasses, and forbs, through perennial grasses and forbs, up to shrubs and trees until you get this climax forest at the end. And for years, decades perhaps, we've taught this, and Dr. Judd was kind of pointing at this earlier. We've taught this SEER. This is a SEER, a sequence of change in a community, and these seral stages, these distinct points along the SEER, we've taught these in the past as being kind of set in stone. You kind of march through each of these stages, and then if a fire or something comes along, it knocks you back to this stage, and you go through the same set of stages, going through the same suite of species until you get back to the same climax community at the end. And so we had a very linear way of thinking about succession. In the last couple of decades, I think there's been a pretty significant move in studies of succession that basically say this is an overly simplified way of thinking about succession, because we don't march through these same stages every time a disturbance occurs. There are different successional pathways that any given community can go through after a particular type of disturbance. And the path that you take is partly dependent upon the disturbances that that community has been subjected to in the past. So one way of thinking about this is when we think about community structure, we're basically thinking about the species abundance of species that are there. And so it's hard to envision this in multi-dimensions because communities oftentimes have hundreds or thousands of species making them up. So let's try and think of this with just 3 species. So the old way of thinking about disturbance in succession is that early in succession, you started out with, a relatively small number of species 1, a relatively small number of species 2, and a relatively small number of species 3. Over time, these species increase in abundance. And in this case, they're increasing in abundance at about the same rate, such that at the end of this series of stages, you have large numbers of species 2, large numbers of species 1, and large numbers of species 3. And then some disturbance takes you back to the beginning where you have relatively few of these, and then you just march through each of these stages again. But what we've come to learn by studying ecosystems where multiple disturbances occur is that this actually isn't how succession plays out. What will happen is as you go through these serial stages, what can happen when a new disturbance occurs, we're at this final stage here where there's a lot of species 3, a lot of species 3, a lot of species 2, and a lot of species 1. But then this disturbance comes along, and rather than knocking that community back to the place that it was before, it takes it to a place where there are very few individuals of species 2 and species 3, but there are a lot of individuals of species 1. And then this community will go through a different set of stages. And what happens over time in this is because you started out with a lot of species 1, species 2 and species 3 don't gain abundance nearly as quickly, because whatever this disturbance was that took it back to a place where there was a lot of species 1 and relatively few individuals of species 2 and species 3, that then inhibited the growth of species 2 and 3 as it went through succession. So oftentimes disturbances, they don't take you back to where you began, they take you back to someplace different. And then you go through succession, but that succession ends up looking different because of this. So a slightly more complicated way of thinking about succession than the way that we used to. Does anybody have any questions about this?
Would you guys call this a simple model of primary or secondary succession?
Secondary.
Yeah, good.
Yep.
And you can imagine how if it was primary, you could start out with a different set of 3 species if they're colonized by 3 different species. And then you have a very different community in terms of composition. So it gets really complicated, and it's easy to imagine how big these interactions can and important they can become.
Yeah, in primary succession, this disturbance would have knocked you out of this cube into another cube with species 4, 5, and 6, for example.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, so it's useful to think about what happens to resource levels after a disturbance. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate this with a concrete example. So there's a place in New Hampshire, and it's called Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. And in this forest, they have their system set up kind of the way Konza Prairie has their system set up. These are different watersheds. And so you can see that these watersheds have been deforested. This is a recently deforested watershed here. And you can see the stream that flows through this watershed, and it leaves this watershed at this point right here. So one of the cool things about this particular system, it's in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, is that by setting it up by this watershed, using these watersheds, they can collect rainfall across the watershed. Here's a clearing here where there are meteorological instruments. There's another clearing here where there are meteorological instruments. And they can basically collect rainfall coming into the ecosystem. Now, when rainfall comes into an ecosystem, there's stuff in that rain. And by collecting it as it comes in without interacting with the plant community at all, they can know exactly what is in that rainfall when they test it for different chemicals, nitrogen, phosphorus, et cetera. And then at the bottom of the watershed, they can measure all of the stream flow that comes out of that watershed. And by looking at what the rainfall is like versus what the stream flow is like, they can basically look at how this ecosystem modifies the water by the ecosystem interacting with that water as it flows through the ecosystem. And that water changes as it flows through the ecosystem. As it flows through the ecosystem, leaches through soil, it picks up nutrients. Depending on how many plants are on that landscape, those plants are also trying to pick up those nutrients. So whether or not you have a forested landscape versus a deforested landscape will have consequences for what the nutrient content of the water is that's coming out here at the bottom. And so what they did as an experiment here in these watersheds is they took these watersheds and they cut them down. Tavares, what can you tell me? Give me some observations about this image. What does it tell you about plant growth and things like this in this forest that has now been deforested? What do you see in this photo?
I see like a little bit of plants starting to grow in the front.
Okay.
And then
go ahead.
Then like as you go back, that's where the plant growth seems like it starts to pick up.
Yeah, so that's a helicopter in the foreground in front of those trees. And what do you notice about the trees themselves?
Oh snap! I didn't know I could pinch it to get bigger.
What's that?
I didn't know I could pinch it. I couldn't really see it at first, but now I can see everything.
Oh yeah, you can make it bigger if you're in side-by-side view, yeah.
Okay. It seemed like they're all like close, like in proximity to each other, like they're close.
Okay, so they're really tightly packed in there. Connor, what else can you see there?
I noticed that like it's not like a gradual, starts with small trees and goes to big. They're all kind of the same size.
Okay, so these trees are all mature. Devin, what do you see? Add to what they've said.
I was kind of gonna have to say the same thing what Connor said, how they're all the same height. All of them are like tall. They really don't have no branches. They just like all one tree, just sprouts all at the top too as well.
That's what I was going for. They only have leaves at the top. Kat, why might this be the case?
Those are that's the part of the tree that gets rainfall and sunlight. The bottom part is kind of shielded from all the elements.
Yeah, and so it wouldn't do a tree any good to invest in leaves down underneath a canopy because those leaves aren't going to be getting much sunlight. And so as these trees grow up, they change their investment strategy from putting out leaves everywhere, all up and down the tree when the tree is young, to only concentrating leaves at the top of the tree where those leaves are actually going to be useful for photosynthesis. Go back and look at Dr. Judd's Cyril stages, that image that he presented, which I'm going to steal and put in my presentation in the future. You'll notice that the climax forest in that image had the trees drawn exactly the way these trees look. They were all spindly with no leaves at the bottom, and they only had leaves at the crown of the tree. So what they did in this ecosystem is they went through and they clear cut it. And they left all of the old trees on the ground so that they could decompose. But for a time period after they made these cuts, they put herbicides on the landscape And they did this to prevent new growth from coming back because they wanted to see what would happen to resources, things like nitrogen and phosphorus and calcium and potassium that are in the soils. They wanted to see what would happen to those things if there wasn't a plant community that was absorbing those materials. So they wanted to see what is the role of the plants on the landscape during succession. What is the role of them in allowing this ecosystem to retain its nutrients rather than have those nutrients flow out of the ecosystem through stream flow, basically. So they clear cut a number of these plots. In some cases, they used different kinds of harvesting methods that are used in forestry. This is actually a U.S. Forest Service site, and so a lot of the research that they're doing is focused on what are the impacts of forestry. And they had Watershed 1, which they didn't deforest, and Watershed 2, which they did deforest. And they published a number of papers comparing these two watersheds. And so here you have precipitation and stream flow. And so the dark images, the dark icons are stream flow. The open icons are precipitation. The squares are Watershed 2, and the triangles are Watershed. Oh, I have Watershed 2 and Watershed 3 actually. There's Watershed 2. Where is Watershed 3? I guess it's next to it over here. So Watershed 2 and Watershed 3. And at the beginning, we'll just first take a look at this image, and Alex, tell me what things jump out at you.
I would say in the year like 1973, like it spiked a lot. That's like
okay. So 1973 was a year with a lot of rainfall, and so it also had a lot of stream flow. What else do you notice?
In 1961, it's really low too.
Okay. All right. So you're seeing just yearly variation in rainfall, which also results in a variation in stream flow. Hunter, what can you add to this? Hunter. Riley, help us out. Hunter seems to not be in class today.
It seems to vary a lot year to year.
So it is variable. So, yep, what else?
I don't know. Watershed 2 and Watershed 3 seem to be pretty similar, and actually,
yeah, because they're right next to one another on the landscape. What else? But they're only similar until when?
I feel like from the years like 1965 to 1973, they vary a lot with stream flow. And then,
yeah, so in 1965, in the winter of 1965, that's when they deforested Watershed 2. And after that happened, the amount of stream flow in Watershed 2 is up there very similar to the amount of precipitation. So one of the other things that you should notice about all of this, Cameron, what's going on with the amount of precipitation and the amount of stream flow?
Yeah, I was noticing that for Watershed 2 precipitation and Watershed 3 precipitation, it's the same, but Watershed 2 stream flow is a lot closer to the precipitation levels.
Yeah, after the deforestation event, but before the deforestation event.
Can you repeat the question real fast? Sorry.
Yeah, so what's going on with precipitation and stream flow? How do they compare before the deforestation event that happened in the winter of 1965?
They were a lot further apart from each other, and then after they started getting closer together.
Okay. So we haven't taught you this, but I just want to see if you know it. What accounts for that difference in precipitation and stream flow? In both of these watersheds, you're getting way more precipitation than you are stream flow. Do you have an idea of why that's the case?
Could some of it be like plant debris blocking some of the water or something, or absorbing?
It's not plant debris blocking. Does anybody else have an idea?
Can you say it has something to do with the rainfall?
It doesn't have to do with rainfall, because if you look at like 1958, the difference between precipitation and stream flow is about the same difference as the difference between those two things in 59 and 60 and 61, etc. Anybody know what plants do that causes them to lose a lot of water? I recognize I'm asking you about something we haven't taught you about yet. Okay, anybody ever hear of a thing called transpiration? Nope, transpiration. Okay, transpiration is the loss of water through the leaves of plants as they go through photosynthesis. And so the difference between the amount of rainfall falling on a landscape and the amount of water that makes it into stream flow is basically a really crude measure of how much water is being lost to the atmosphere as these plants that are on the landscape go through the process of photosynthesis. So as soon as you get rid of all those plants, stream flow pops up to very close to precipitation levels, because all the water that falls on the landscape just flows through the soil, flows into the stream, and exits the weir at the bottom of the watershed. And so this difference between this black square and this black triangle, that's the difference in transpiration between a deforested watershed and an intact watershed. And over time, what happens to those stream flow numbers? By the time you get to 1978, 1979, what's happened to stream flow in watershed 2 and watershed 3?
They're almost the same again.
They're almost the same again, because what's happened over that time period from 1966 until 1978, 79, 80?
Everything was like able to like regrow, or like new plants were able to come in and regrow to like make up for what had been taken out.
Yeah, so those plants regrew, they started doing photosynthesis again, and as a result of that, they start returning all that water back to the atmosphere as they do photosynthesis. So now stream flow is more closely correlated in those two watersheds, whereas it wasn't very well correlated with one another back here. Stream flow much higher in watershed 2 than it is in watershed 3 in the years immediately after the deforestation event. So what happens though when this occurs is that it changes what happens to the nutrients. So this is a figure also from your book, if I recall correctly. And so here we have in this first panel is plant biomass. There was a lot of plant biomass on the landscape before the deforestation. After the deforestation, and they suppressed the regrowth of the plants, there was very low biomass because they cut all the trees down, and then they prevented them from growing back because of by applying herbicides. But then once they stopped applying herbicides, you can see that plant biomass takes off, and it returns pretty quickly. Once you free it up, the ecosystem itself starts to generate a lot of plant biomass. And it's because these trees and shrubs are starting to go through this process of succession. So there's this portion here when succession is suppressed. And when succession is suppressed, look what happens to different kinds of nutrients. The two watersheds before deforestation were all fairly similar in terms of the amount of calcium, potassium, and nitrogen that were leaving the ecosystem in stream flow. But as soon as you do this cut, the cut watershed, which is the red icons, has a lot of loss of calcium, loss of potassium, and loss of nitrate leaving the ecosystem through stream flow, presumably because those ecosystems aren't able to retain those nutrients because there are no plants growing on the landscape. But as soon as you let the plants start to return, those plants send down roots into the soil. Those roots are picking up the nutrients that are in the soil, and this ecosystem becomes less leaky as a result of the plants basically sequestering those nutrients into their plant bodies. So this ecosystem is less leaky with plants when there are plants on the landscape, and it's leakier when those plants are not there, until by about 9 or 10 years after the clear cut, those organisms have basically returned nitrate levels kind of back to background levels in terms of the nutrients that are being exported from the ecosystem in stream flow. So you can see that even in this first year, which wouldn't have had a ton of regrowth anyway, that first year led to a big export of nutrients out of the ecosystem. And so this is informative because it tells us that one of the things that disturbances do is they not only alter the relative abundance of the different species that are there and the biomass of those species, but it also has big influences on the potential nutrients that are available, the resources that are available in these ecosystems. So what resources are important for plant growth and reproduction? What are the kinds of things that you would guess based on your knowledge of basic chemistry? What are the major macromolecules that we think of when we think of the molecules that make up living things?
Carbon.
Nitrogen. Okay, so now you're giving me elements. So carbon, nitrogen.
Phosphorus.
Phosphorus. So you guys remember what the major biological macromolecules are? Big classes of molecules like carbohydrates. What are some of the other ones?
Lipids.
Lipids. What else?
Proteins.
Proteins, which we've already talked about in this class. What's the molecule that helps us specify what the amino acid sequence is in a protein?
DNA.
Yeah, so nucleic acids.
Yeah.
So an easy way to think about what major molecules are important is to think what major molecule, and one way to think of what elements are important in terms of nutrients is to think what elements are involved in making each of these. So carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids have what?
Phosphates, right?
So they can have they all have carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, but they also have phosphates and phospholipids that are in your cell membranes. What do proteins have?
Amino acids.
So what's an amino acid made up of in terms of elements? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. What's the amine group? What's that?
Is it nitrogen? I think that's wrong.
It is nitrogen. No, you're not wrong. And what else do they have? This one is less common, but some amino acids have this.
Phosphorus?
Not phosphorus. I always think of this particular element around Halloween. I'll
Is it
just give to
sulfur?
you. Sulfur, yep, there you go. And then what do nucleic acids have? You've already seen the structure of DNA and RNA. They'll have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. What's the backbone? It's a sugar backbone, which is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Then what else is in the backbone of the molecule?
Nitrogen and phosphorus.
Okay, so nitrogen is in the nitrogenous bases, and phosphorus is part of the sugar phosphate backbone. So it's pretty easy to see what things are important by just looking at the major macromolecules. But then there are a bunch of trace elements that are also important. So there are also things like calcium and potassium and things like this that organisms also need. So where do these resources come from the perspective of plants? Where are plants getting their nutrients?
The soil or the air?
Yeah, they're going to be primarily getting them from the soil, and they do get them from things like rainfall and things like that, but generally only after those things have fallen down to the earth and become incorporated into soil.
Can you explain why you said air?
Yeah, I said air just because like through photosynthesis, they intake O2, right? And that's one of the...
Not O2, it's a different molecule.
Oh, CO2, sorry.
Right. Okay, good. But yeah, so the other ones come from the soil. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. And nitrogen can come from the air. So there's nitrogen oxides that are floating around in dust, and they get taken out of the atmosphere in rainfall and things like that. But generally, those aren't huge amounts of nitrogen, for example, that come to plants from the atmosphere. Nitrogen coming into the soil from the atmosphere is mainly done by bacteria that go through a process called nitrogen fixation, which we'll talk to you about after you've gone through and learned about photosynthesis. So remember that in Lacke-Volterra way of thinking about competition, we have species 1 and we have species 2. And these things go from very few organisms to a lot of organisms on the landscape. Once again, very few to a lot. And we created these zero net growth isoclines where species 1's carrying capacity is right here. And species 1 is limited by the number of species 2 that's defined by K1 divided by alpha. And that makes a zero net growth isocline here. And species 2 has a carrying capacity, and it has an effective competition by species 1 that is K2 divided by beta. And when we connect these, when we draw these zero net growth isoclines, down here is positive growth because there aren't very many individuals on the landscape. They have lots of resources available to them, so competition is relatively low. And so in this case, both species are growing. Species 1 is increasing and species 2 is increasing, so they're moving up. And then out here, population growth is moving in a negative direction because both of the species are above their carrying capacity. And what that means is that both species, in this case, are declining because they don't have enough resources to survive. And so they're heading down here. And then we could also fill in what's happening here as well. Species 1 is declining here. Species 1 is increasing here. Species 2 is increasing here and declining here. And so this represents the stable equilibrium form of the Lacke-Volterra equations. But what I want you to think about in this scenario where we're talking about the population sizes of the two species, positive growth occurs when the species are low in number, and negative growth occurs when the species are high in number. The system of thinking about competition that I'm about to show you flips that on its head. You're going to have negative growth down here and positive growth down here, up here, because we're not going to be plotting the population sizes of the two species. we're actually going to be plotting resource availability of the various resources that the species need. So I wanted to show you this before we get to the Tillman way of thinking about resource limitation and competition, so that you don't get too confused. Recognize that we're going to be putting different things on the X and Y axis in the next way of thinking about competition. As a result, we have to flip what's positive growth and what's negative growth. Everybody clear? Okay. So this way of thinking about competition was put forth by a guy named David Tillman at the University of Minnesota back in the late 70s and early 80s. And it basically thinks about competition from the standpoint of resources. So here we have resource 1, and I've colored it yellow simply because a lot of times I think of resource 1 as light when I think about plants. All plants need light to survive. Yep.
Share again.
Oh, am I not?
You
I am
were
sharing.
It was both. Sorry. Never mind.
No, that's fine. So I oftentimes think of resource 1 as sunlight, because all plants need sunlight in order to do photosynthesis, except for those couple of, not very many plants that don't do photosynthesis. Nathan, do you know of any plants that don't do photosynthesis?
Yeah, there's quite a few parasitic plants that are fun to think about.
Yep. I'm thinking about orchid in Puerto Rico that is a detritus. It gets all of its energy from detritus.
There's a
This
purple
weird
conifer on the island of New Caledonia that is entirely parasitic.
Oh yeah. This orchid, it's tan and has a white flower, and it lives on decaying vegetation in the forests of Puerto Rico. But generally speaking, we can think of light as being a resource that plants need. And then we can also think of resource 2, and resource 2 might be something like nitrogen. Nitrogen is important for making proteins and for making nucleic acids. And as we've already seen from the Hubbard Brook example, it's something that flows out of ecosystems relatively easily because it gets leached out of soils by water. So you can imagine 2 plants, and one plant requires a lot of light and very little nitrogen. And so we can show its resource requirements by basically drawing a line up where its light requirements are and drawing a line across where its nitrogen requirements are. And because light is going from very little light to lots of light, and nitrogen is going from very little light to very little nitrogen to lots of nitrogen, this is a species that is a high light, low nitrogen species. So needs a lot of light and needs very little nitrogen. So underneath and to the left here is a series of situations where there's not enough nitrogen and not enough light for this species to survive. To the upper left of this is a situation where there's plenty of light and plenty of nitrogen for this species to survive, but also for that species to grow. We can imagine another species in the same landscape that doesn't need very much light, but requires a good deal more nitrogen. We could show its resource requirements by another set of lines, one line representing low light requirements, but then a higher line representing high nitrogen requirements. Any place to the left and below of these 2 lines represents negative population growth. Any place above that nitrogen requirement and that light requirement represents positive population growth. So what would we call these lines? What are these lines referring to? You have a term in your toolbox of terms now for this. If there's positive growth here and negative growth here, what kind of population growth is going on the line?
Is that like the carrying capacity?
So it's like carrying capacity, but what did Dr. Judd call these lines when we were using them in the Lotka-Volterra way of thinking about things?
You guys remember the acronym?
What does ZNGI stand for?
Isn't it like zero negative growth isoclines?
Not zero negative growth, zero net growth.
Okay.
Zero net growth isocline. So each of these lines represent a ratio of light and nitrogen at which the orange species has zero net growth. The green line represents a ratio of nitrogen and light at which the green species has zero net growth. Get more light and more nitrogen than that, and the population grows. Get less nitrogen or less light than that, and the population declines. We will pick this up on Monday. Do you guys have any questions? All right, then I will see you guys on Monday then.